Thank you so much for being here. This is the first of the Humanities Center's 2017-18 series of guest talks organized as part of our theme for the year, Food And we are thrilled to have Alice Julier as our opening speaker. Many of you know me. I'm Dorothy Chansky. I am the director of the Humanities Center. And just want to take a minute to talk about this annual theme, Food And. Ways into the what, following the ellipsis in food and, ... Food and what? Well, food and culture, literature, politics, environment, technology, health, malnutrition, access, education, inequities, media representations, depictions in fine art, sustainability, ecologies, localities, small-scale agriculture, agribusiness, taboo, packaging, eating disorders, marketing, terroir, and gastronomy, and that's not a complete list. We all eat. Yet what counts as appealing, nourishing, traditional food in one culture is repulsive in another. What's cheap and ordinary in one time and place is a luxury in another. Now, we at the Humanities Center hope that as you leave, you'll take one of our flyers and newsletters. I think some of you are already on our mailing list and have them, but take two, they're small. And note the dates and venues for the rest of the talks in the series. Now, this talk is special not only because Alice Julier is full of joy, energy, enthusiasm, experience, and a ton of insight, but because we have a special guest sponsor for this event, the Texas Tech Libraries. And I don't know if the Dean of the Libraries is here just yet, Bella Carr-Gerlach. If you're here, stand up and be counted. She'll be here. And actually, we have two co-sponsors. The Texas Tech University Friends of the Libraries have also helped make this event possible. Any members of that group here? Well, thanks to them anyway in absentia. Okay, Alice's talk tonight invites us to think about the role restaurants play in making sense of food, not just making meals that are tasty or convenient or elegant. She points us to the idea that the restaurant is always situated somewhere. Food can be packaged or carried out, but the restaurant is a destination that's embedded somewhere. Restaurants are a barometer of change and continuity in urban areas. Utilizing media promotion of the food scene, as well as participant observation of restaurants and chefs, Alice's talk examines cities as consumption theme parks based on geographic and culinary traditions that are both real and reimagined for new urban residents and tourists. The food scene is a facet of gentrification, and gentrification centers on a racial project of simultaneously celebrating and homogenizing racial and ethnic differences. And I'll say, a few of us had lunch with her today, and she said, well, I'm really, mostly talking about one city. So we started hitting her with hard questions about other cities, and man, she's good. She's thought about it. So, hit her with hard questions. While gentrification is always a mixed process, this talk will explore the narratives that tie uniquely local or regional food to places as sites of tourism, commerce, and politics. Alice Julier is a sociologist who focuses on food, material life, and inequality. I first knew her as an online presence on the Association for the Study of Food and Society listserv. Like many listservs, this one had its share of nitpickers, lovers of esoterica, complainers, and, yeah, smart contributors. Alice was more than just one of the smart contributors. She became, over the 2 years that I lurked on the list, the one whose posts I most looked forward to. When I finally met her at a food and culture conference 7 years ago, I was not disappointed at all. In fact, I began thinking even then of how I might get her to Texas Tech. This was long before we had a Humanities Center, so yay, Humanities Center, we got her here. Alice Julier is the founding director of the Food Studies program at Chatham University and director of CRAFT, C-R-A-F-T, the Center for Regional Agriculture, Food, and Transformation. She writes about food systems, domesticity, and family meals and labor in food systems. She is the former president of the Association for the Study of Food and Society and a council member for the Agriculture, Food, and Human Values Society. Her most recent book is Eating Together, Food, Friendship, and Inequality, and she is also the co-editor of the upcoming edition of Food and Culture, A Reader. So please join me in welcoming Alice Julia.
Boy, thanks, Dorothy. That's a lot to live up to. We'll see if I meet all those expectations. And I understand I have to be wired for sound. Here we go. So thanks again for having me, and everyone for inviting me. And I have to say, ironically, it's been 90 degrees and dry in Pittsburgh for the last 2 weeks, so I'm excited about your rain, and I'm enjoying this weather, and I'm enjoying Lubbock. So just to say a little bit more about myself and my interests and how I got to this space. I actually began life as a sociologist who studied women and health and social movements, and somehow along the line that morphed into thinking about food, and partly because I was tired of thinking about politics and tired of thinking a little bit about all the theoretical aspects of social movements, and so I tried to pick a topic that didn't have any of that, going on, and now 20 plus years later, food is all about politics. I mean, it always was, but there's no getting away from it now. And so embracing that and thinking about these topics, I recently have been working on a larger project that thinks about how different people in that food system engage in political action, engage in constructing a reality that allows them to think about what they get to eat, what rights they have, what responsibilities they have. And that can go anywhere from looking at chefs to community members to other kinds of participants, families. So for this talk, I'm only focusing on one little piece of all of that, and I'm mainly going to tell you some stories because we're still thinking about how this works and what it means. So for me, thinking about what I was going to say here started when I turned on the television and started watching one of Spike Lee's films, Do the Right Thing. And my reaction was, oh, a classic. And I had two thoughts. One was, it's really odd to be reaching a time when some of Spike Lee's films are now old. And two, I'm really grateful that part of what I get to do for a living is think about what randomly comes on television. So for those of you that might not have seen Do the Right Thing or seen it recently or been around when it came out in the late 1980s, right, this film is about Brooklyn and the racial tensions that arise one very hot summer around an Italian pizzeria in the Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood, or Bed-Stuy as it's known. The pizza parlor is a neighborhood place, and many locals who are also African American, almost all of them are African American, eat there, and Lee's character works in the pizzeria alongside the Italian American owner and his son. And the whole arc of the story revolves around the fact that the pizzeria has this wall of fame, which only includes photos of actors of Italian descent. And the arguments about whether or not it should include famous black actors culminates in violence and death. Critic Roger Ebert wrote when he saw the film for the first time, and I quote, "Spike Lee has done an almost impossible thing. He's made a movie about race in America that empathized with all the participants. He didn't draw lines or take sides, but simply looked with sadness at one racial flashpoint that stood among the others." So, although I've seen the movie multiple times, this time, while sitting and actually writing about gentrification and food, I realized I'd almost forgotten that the story takes place around a restaurant. And Brooklyn, in the last 25 years, has become the touchstone example of gentrification, the place everyone wants to live, no one can afford, and there's really good food. So in 2014, wearing a Defend Brooklyn sweatshirt, Spike Lee gave this interview where he weighed in on what's happened to his home neighborhood. His anger was in response to an article in the New York Magazine that, with the title, "Is Gentrification Always Bad?" And Lee angrily said, and I quote, "You can't just come into a neighborhood. I'm for democracy and letting everyone in, but you gotta have some respect. You can't just come in where people have a culture that's been laid down for generations, and you come in now and shit gotta change because you're here." And he goes on with lots of expletives for another 5 or 10 minutes. So this debate went on in social media and the Times and a bunch of other venues in early 2014. And so on the one hand, gentrification in Brooklyn has already happened. On the other hand, there are many sections of that borough that are still occupied by people with less economic means. So if you look at recent demographics, about 30% of the residents are African American, 20% are Hispanic or Latino, and the median household income is less than $40,000 a year. So, and just for comparison, in Manhattan, it's about 70. So while all analysts agree that at some level, historically, in the long view, neighborhoods are constantly changing, and the current pressures on American cities are coming from certain things, right? Increasing urbanization, greater income inequality, rising housing costs, and the very nature of what happens to cities when they are no longer the centers of manufacturing, but of service and retail and finance. But I focus on Lee's point about how the cultures that evolve and solidify around place are important. Embedded in there is a question of who has the power to determine what stays, what goes, what changes. So power in our world often boils down to money, to economic capital. But in particular, this process of gentrification means that people with resources and money are drawn to an area not only because it's affordable, but because it has a culture that's appealing and attractive to live within. So my interest in this as a scholar of social life and food is that in these contexts, what we often mean by culture is people with really interesting food. So I just want to clarify too that gentrification is only one means of talking about the economic inequality in relation to place. It's a term that has scholarly significance, but people use it frequently in the vernacular to capture something, a process of displacement, a feeling of not belonging to where they did belong, regardless of what the numbers about who has moved out and who has moved in tell you. So, you know, whether or not we can debate whether it's real, the feeling that people have about it and the way in which it affects them as a community is important. So in much of what I read about cities and food, it's important to note that gentrification is a specifically racialized term. And the scholars Omi and Wynant mean this talking about a racial project in the sense that, in this case, it's enacted around African American neighborhoods in a way that's connected to and built upon a long history of structural racism and segregation. When a neighborhood gets gentrified, African Americans are not generally moving up, they're moving out. They may benefit if they're lucky enough to be homeowners who can sell for a profit, but this often means they cannot or do not stay. The key factor in this case is whether or not migration is a choice. And New York is what we might call hyper-gentrified, in that there are almost no affordable areas to live without a long and distant commute, with small-scale stores of all types being wiped out in record time. Poor people are displaced, they live in increasingly bounded areas that are not yet gentrified, they move further out, or in some numbers become homeless. The people who do service and municipal work, cleaning and care work, food work, restaurant work, travel into the city on commuter and private buses. Many middle-class people, particularly young ones with families, move away to more affordable areas of the country that have jobs in growth areas of skill like technology, healthcare, and finance. So where do they go? Well, the city that I live in now, Pittsburgh, is one of those places where people are moving. It's a city situated between 3 rivers, bounded by steep hills. And the history of migration into the city is related to its past as this industrial Rust Belt giant, right? Where manufacturing happened very much in these urban areas. Because these industries collapsed in the 1970s and were not replaced, there's actually been very little in-migration by ethnic racial groups into the city until recently. And attempts at fixing the problems with urban renewal and community development have had very mixed results. There's a tiny population of Latino immigrants. There are Asian, South Asian, and specifically Indian and Bangladeshi populations, mostly middle and upper middle class, who are connected to the universities like Carnegie Mellon or to healthcare professions, which now make up the largest employment sector in the region. The generational residents of Pittsburgh, who are often white, still retain some of their ethnic hyphenated identities: Croatian, Italian, Polish, Macedonian, a whole host of other Eastern European places. And they're quite aware of the differences between what it means to be one or the other. Those identities are also tightly focused around foodways of the past, right? When we think about how traditions and how those relationships last for people who are of white ethnic groups, cultural traditions like dance are retained in smaller circles, but language often goes. What remains is food. That said, there are efforts to preserve that in a region that's not based on recent migration, but that past. But for African Americans, many of whom migrated north and came late to the steel boom, it has meant a particular kind of historical isolation, especially when people are displaced by development. The most famous of these is the Hill District. It's literally located on a hill, a neighborhood on a hill. It's been written about by the playwright August Wilson. Rich in Black Renaissance history, a place of music and food, the famous Crawford Grill, its menu being posted in many places, and its jazz greats coming through, noted. By the 1950s, it was already isolated. The area was declared blighted, and then it was bisected by urban renewal projects that left residents without access to transportation, jobs, and food. So those restaurants and jazz clubs, which were often integrated, lost customers, lost access. And this process is documented in the plays of August Wilson and his Pittsburgh cycle, as well as the photographs of Teenie Harris. Today, it's a focus of much redevelopment with lots of discussion about what goes there and what doesn't. And another neighborhood, which is called East Liberty, has often taken up some of the displacement of those residents as well. So, you thought this was a talk about food. How does food fit into this discussion of place? My own interests in food are focused on how we talk and think about it. So as a sociologist, as Dorothy said, I'm really interested in the meaning behind meals, whether they're eaten at home or in public spaces like restaurants. And as I've studied this, place, the where we produce and consume food, has become more complex and more interesting and more layered the more I listen and learn. Quite simply, consider how both positive and negative sensory memories about food are not only just about what we ate and who you ate with, but where you ate it as well, right? Where were you when this happened? There's so much discourse right now about where your food comes from and what local means, and it depends on where you live. So both the narrative and the empirical reality suggest that food's a significant part of gentrification. As one man in Pittsburgh put it, he said, as soon as the Artist Cafe goes in, you're supposed to move out. Restaurants, ones that are a destination at first, where people will go out of their way to eat there, are the first layer of gentrification. People move in next. It has to be an interesting area if there are shops and places to eat. And then the rents go up and housing prices start to go up. So it's not exactly the same in any given area. You know, this is not sort of a perfect narrative, but there is sort of a way in which those spaces, the restaurants and the little shops, are the harbingers of change. So what I've been interested in are the cultural stories that shape this, right? We know these racial projects don't happen like magic, but they represent a process of change that's tied to other social and demographic factors. And over the years, I've kind of been looking at this ethnographically. I've been fascinated by the question about how do people learn about the changing nature of place? How do they find out in a very simple way it's a place that has good restaurants? Who's telling them, right? There must have been restaurants prior to the ones that are drawing attention. How did these become cool and interesting and serving food that you want to eat? How did they get onto that location? The phrase you often see in social media on food or place websites is, this neighborhood has a great food scene. And so I took that word, that phrase, food scene, quite literally, and I've been exploring what does it mean for a place to have one, and how does it emerge? And then how does it tie back to spaces and processes of gentrification? Now, yeah, I am a sociologist and I like numbers and I like concrete data. How many restaurants, how long do they last? But in this instance and in this talk, I'm going to focus a little bit more on the narratives, the stories that are told about people and places and food, who gets to tell them, what power they have in shaping the material reality of that neighborhood. In particular, I'm interested in what groups of people have influence in the public discourse and what medium they use to do so, to either create or resist that food scene. When I first started writing about food and social life in the 90s, there were not very many books or conferences or programs or wonderful things like this, even though there's lots of ongoing scholarship about food. But food was still interesting and on the rise and part of a cultural conversation. So Roger Abrahams was writing about the ways in which ethnic food becomes culinary capital, said, and I quote, "One is overwhelmed by the sheer amount of discussion in Middle America, a culture of cooking, different diets, new restaurants, and food stores opening up. Since the 1980s, it appears that the cultural conversation about food has only increased. Talking about food in our culture is ubiquitous as talking about television, and this talk is gender and class-based," unquote. Abrahams and people like me reading and writing about this could not have realized in the 90s how exponentially this has increased, both in academia and popular discourse. We now have a lot of places where people tell stories about food. There's so much to read, I can't keep up, even with just comes out in the news on a daily basis. So print magazines like Gourmet and Food and Wine, these have had their heyday, right? So later this year when former editor and writer Ruth Reichel comes to speak about this, I hope it'll be interesting for you to hear and talk to her about the rise of food journalism in print and its subsequent demise. Now there are online sources like Food Tank and Eater. There are social media approaches to restaurants, right? Chowhound and Yelp, these kind of publicly sourced pieces of information. And then, of course, I'm just going to vaguely mention that other thing, the Food Network, and all of the explosion of shows and celebrities and food knowledges that have been promoted there and more. So all of that kind of creates a large conversation among a lot of different kinds of people, all of whom seem to have something to say in which they believe they have some expertise. So the question again for me is, how does a place become a destination with a food scene, both for tourism and for relocation? So one thing I started noticing was the way the New York Times and other places become famous for filling up their travel sections with articles like this, right? There was one actually last week about a village in Italy that no one knows about, right? And there's one with a restaurant at the top of the hill that you have to really work to find. And for example, because I read that article, my Facebook and social media feed is now filling up with ads for flights, tours, restaurants in Italy. And so what happens is you become part of an algorithm the minute you start thinking that way, right? And this is mirrored in television shows, right? Notably, the ones with Anthony Bourdain, right, does the same thing, takes you someplace you might never ever go. And the story isn't necessarily about the food, but there's a lot of food in it, right? But also consider that, across the spectrum, right, Guy Fieri traveling to diners and dives contributes the same dynamic and history that was popularized by Jan and Michael Stern in the 1980s, right? We can travel to these places and consume what's there. All of this have added enormously to this story about inaccessible, accessible spaces with food. So, food and place are a tale that are told in many venues for different audiences. But the point is, there's a huge palette out there of opportunities to consume a narrative about how food makes a place and the experience that one can have either visiting or eating in that storyline. The best example of these for me are the ones that are titled 24 hours in, ... right, and then pick your destination. And as you go into a destination and the writer tells you all the things you must see, where to stay, and mostly what to eat, right? These are tantalizing for a particular reason, I think, and this is not trivial, right? You get the thrill of something new. and unique, but you don't have to do the risk and the work it takes to actually go and discover those things on your own, right? And so there's something about this construct about safety, about experiencing the new without all the risk that comes with that I think is very important. And then there's the food itself, right? The type of food and who's willing to eat it and why. On the one hand, there is what Krishnendu Ray calls an ethnic succession in restaurants, where the food of different immigrant groups becomes popular and popularized to a larger audience of consumers based on an evolving hierarchy of taste, a construction of trend. On the other hand, some cuisines, particularly contested ones, don't always travel into the hierarchy in the same way. Right? So, for example, despite popularization, many Asian restaurants can't enter into the high cuisine status because people are unwilling to pay high prices for these foods. Partly it's, quote unquote, they're used to paying less, and partly it's because they don't see these as highly skilled, highly technical, cuisines that deserve some sort of compensation in the same way. Similarly, African American foods are only recently being presented as culturally interesting cuisines, and often in a conflation with Southern food and soul food that flattens out a rich and complex history of Black diaspora. That said, restaurants in areas under gentrification are at the mercy of a larger discourse about what counts as interesting and good food, and who knows about it and how they know about it. Margot Finn, in her new book that's called Discriminating Taste, argues that there's been a comprehensive transformation in how Americans buy, cook, eat, and talk about and imagine food. To Finn and others, this food revolution includes the rise of celebrity chefs, increased spending on both cooking and dieting foods, people buying gadgets, programs, and options for other types of food. Think about things like Blue Apron and these other take-home meal, cooking at home sort of ventures. At the same time, we note that there's a declining percentage of people who say they cook on a regular basis. Finn and others argue that this is partly due to change, consolidation, and innovation in the agriculture and food processing arena. Some of it is due to immigration, migration, and a growing acceptance of multiculturalism, albeit not unchallenged. And some of it is due to environmental and health concerns, right? So people eat the way they eat because they're worried about their long-term well-being. The idea of a food revolution is another example of how technologies, research, and wealth enable people to improve so-called the deficiencies of the past, right? We eat better now, and it's a demonstration of our progress. Finn argues, and she calls this culinary enlightenment, makes Americans believe that our food should be, and this is often a simultaneously occurring list: better, cheaper, fresh, whole, organic, local, sustainable, artisanal, healthy, and diverse. And it's that last point, I think, that's important to me. So Finn, among others, points out that the reason why this is becoming more and more important in our culture is because of income and status inequality. Food's become this touchstone for these class-based differences, such that dreams of good food play a unique role in the construction of social distinctions. Food is often this compensatory arena of aspiration, so people can distinguish themselves by what they consume, what they know, and where to get it. And as Abrams pointed out back in 1984, this is also shaped by gender, who is often producing the food, and race, how the food gets defined. So my own contribution to this discussion is a focus on how this culinary enlightenment that Finn talks about is created. That is, it's supported and promoted by critics, commentators, writers. In his analysis of the production of culture, Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist, posits that critics are very crucial to sanctioning and giving meaning to objects that are otherwise would not necessarily have value or necessity in a cultural context. So In that sense, foods have no intrinsic meaning as status symbols. One cuisine is not inherently more complex or valuable than another, but rather how we talk about it, how we enculturate it, gives it a meaning and a value that's only tangentially connected to the foodstuffs that it's made with and the value therein, right? So we tend to think about things that are more expensive being rare ingredients, and yet it doesn't always translate into how that plays out in terms of the way we value them. Those writing about food may not have the economic capital to be elite, but they have the training and the certification that allows them to comment on the restaurant, the cuisine, the type of wine, and what it's worth spending to eat there. So food critics and journalists are really deeply influential in this realm, right? Think about how people credit writing by Michael Pollan and Mark Bittman as the impetus for their interest in alternative food politics and consumption. The New York Times food section has grown from this tiny thing to an entire sort of piece of the paper. And often the articles in that section are the top of the most read list. Other venues include online things like Food Tank and Eater, Lucky Peach, the magazine, and more, all vie for influence in the current food writing landscape. And to me, this is a contribution to that notion of a food scene. It's also interesting because it's happening at a time when it's incredibly fraught to be a food writer or a journalist, right? There are very few jobs in traditional media and limitations otherwise in terms of what you can do to actually earn a living doing this. That said, national, local, and online media write about food extensively. It's a big portion of what you see, with a strong emphasis on culinary tourism, whether they use that phrase or not. It is, as Bourdieu would say, a contested field in which being able to assert what's good or bad or valued also then gives you value within that realm. So I don't think any of that is surprising. I mean, food critics have had that function in society in multiple ways and for a long time. But what became interesting to me in this is how people outside professional journalism have been contributing to this food scene, right? So Sharon Zukin and her co-authors did this great study of Yelp reviews. And they argue that they create cultural and financial value for restaurants and end up constructing a positive or negative image of the location as well. And that ends up leading to economic growth and investment. So they did an analysis of, back to Brooklyn, two neighborhoods, Bedford-Stuy and Greenpoint, which are both gentrifying, but each by displacing different populations, right? So in Greenpoint, it's lower income whites. In Bedford-Stuyvesant, it's lower income African Americans. And they found what you might expect. It's a great study, but the conclusions are exactly what you'd think, right? That when the reviewers, when they pointed to the location, which was often, they were often more positive about white neighborhoods, saw more food options there, and often saw the black neighborhoods as risky and unsafe. They also didn't talk about the food options in the black neighborhoods in the same positive light. Zukin and her authors call this discursive redlining, harkening back to the real estate processes that create racial and ethnic ghettos, right? I don't know if you know much about redlining, but redlining was this process in which real estate agents chose neighborhoods and literally drew lines around them and discouraged people for getting mortgages and buying houses in those based on racial and ethnic populations living there. So increasingly, what to me was interesting was that the Yelp reviewers often do, in fact, talk about their role in gentrification. Like, they do comment on the locale and what they're saying. Like, if I send people here, what will that do? Right? I'm telling you about this place, but don't send all your friends. I mean, sort of this interesting contradiction in the way in which they would talk about it. All this to say is that there's both a popular and a professional commentary about what's going on and about what makes a good food scene and what makes a great city. And so I've really been turning this lens back upon my own place of residence a lot. And I was prompted to think again about who and what contributes to that story of place, specifically places with good food. Recently, when on social media, the mayor of Pittsburgh and one of the city councilmen happily posted this social media link to a new article in Food and Wine that was entitled, "Where to Eat in Pittsburgh." And it's this kind of uncritical, jaunty piece that focuses on 5 white male chefs who always get the most media attention in the new green Pittsburgh. And as I mentioned before, Pittsburgh is a quintessential Rust Belt city. Right, it suffered from decline in the 80s, and until recently had little economic or population growth, and no recovery like some other cities where coal and steel collapsed. Pittsburgh, with this history of elite classes full of steel industry magnates and robber barons, had food that was resolutely divided by class and ethnicity. And so there are 2 iconic foods of Pittsburgh from this time frame, both kind of from the immigrant past. One are sandwiches that are made by a place called the Primanti Brothers, right? Vaguely Italian, you get that. But the sandwiches are famous because they put French fries inside and on them, right? The historical suggestion being that steel workers in a hurry could just pick this up and go and eat this one with one hand. And so it is beloved by Pittsburghers, and people outside don't understand why one would ever want soggy French fries. So it's an interesting, right? It's about constructing a sensibility about an insider, you know, who you are as a participant in that culture, and liking those sandwiches and eating there as being a participant. The other food is pierogies, which, if you are unfamiliar, are a Polish, Ukrainian, Eastern European filled dumpling. How many people know what they are? Okay, good. All right. See, I don't even have to explain. So older ladies in church kitchens make dozens of these, right, for bazaars and festivals. There are multiple local companies, not one, not 2, but multiple local companies that sell fresh and frozen versions. And the Major League Baseball team, the Pirates, at every game they have 4 people dressed as pierogies that race around the field during the 7th inning stretch, right? And it took me a while, the first time I went to a game, to understand that that's what those were. Like, they were just these people in these kind of gray-brown, you know, like, imagine a dumpling as a costume, right? And you get the idea. In the last decade, Pittsburgh has really undergone a transformation. Not only in the last 10 years, but you really have felt it in the last 10 years. With this increase in the high-tech industry, companies like Google opening offices in town, a very large healthcare industry, as well as a real push for green and sustainable initiatives that have mitigated some of that industrial pollution and degradation from decades of manufacturing. It's constantly being cited in the media as a most livable, family-friendly, green city in various publications. And along with this transformation, of course, has come a process of gentrification that's aided by this creation of a food scene. With comparisons to Brooklyn and Portland, Oregon, the emphasis is on how affordable it is to live there and how good these restaurants are. So I knew something was going on when someone came to the city and called it the next Brooklyn. As any good ethnographer can tell you, sooner or later you get implicated in what's going on. And my own participation in some of this is as the director of a food studies program. And a few years back, we hosted a conference of food and agriculture scholars. And as part of that, we created a bunch of tours for local food systems. And one tour was of a neighborhood called Lawrenceville, which was predominantly Italian-American, but mostly a cheap place where people could live along the river. And about 2010, it started changing, which is why we chose to highlight it, right? We really wanted to sort of show people what was going on. And one stop on the tour was a restaurant owned by a James Beard award-winning chef, who said to the tour participants, and I quote, "I put my restaurant here deliberately when no one else would come here because I saw the potential, but I single-handedly had to drive away all the drug dealers and prostitutes," unquote. Now, not only did he say that, but it's a phrase I've heard him repeat and has appeared in print multiple times. Like, in other words, it's his trope, right? In this case, what interests me isn't the hubris of chefs, particularly these white male award-winning chefs, but of the way the food critics and writers have repeatedly picked up this statement and reprinted it uncritically in articles and reviews and celebrations of the best chef, best restaurant in the city, right? In other words, it's a badge of honor to be able to say that we have this chef and we have this restaurant and we have taken over this space and we've, quote unquote, cleaned it up. Being a mid-sized city, there's one print newspaper, one online paper, a glossy city magazine, 2 food magazines, and a few publications focused on sustainability. That means there are less journalists and critics writing than there might be elsewhere. And as I pointed to the Food and Wine article earlier, the one that the mayor retweeted, national publications often take their verbiage and their recommendations almost directly from the local writers. If you were to look at these publications, and I've done some text analysis and counting here, you would find the same 5 chefs and 3 restaurant group owners, all of whom are white men, mentioned 4 times more frequently than anyone else. There are 2 or 3 women chefs who have been pushed into the story about the food scene, but they're often only talked about as women chefs. So what I want to kind of end today with are 2 stories, which is sort of even a little bit deeper dive into how gentrification in food is being created by both food writers and by the responses on social media and elsewhere by the people who live and work in those spaces. So, you know, what I want to say is it's not an uncontested process. So the first story is about barbecue. There's a little bit of food in this talk. Those of us who study food know that barbecue is, in fact, the most contested and perhaps the most quintessential American food, with regional variations, deep roots, right, to indigenous people, people of color, migrants, as well as white settlers, right? Everybody owns barbecue in some way or another. The food critic for Pittsburgh Magazine, which is one of the most read online restaurant pieces, recently wrote a short article about a new barbecue place opening in town called Spork Pit. The writer quotes the owner, who has been to Austin once, by the way, and is now bringing Austin-style barbecue to Pittsburgh because, and I quote, "It's something really lacking here in Pittsburgh. The barbecue scene up here is not good." The critic in the article then goes on to agree with him, saying, quote, "He's not far off the mark, although Pork and Beans downtown does a knock-up job with smoked ribs, turkey, and at least on my most recent visit, brisket. There is still plenty of room for killer smoked meats in Pittsburgh," unquote. I should mention that Pork and Beans is owned by one of those 5 chefs who always gets mentioned in these articles. So you see sort of this construct, this kind of almost like tautological circle of who's important and what food is important and how do we talk about it. And what happened is on social media and in the comments section of the magazine online, people bombarded them. People went nuts and bombarded them. Now, partly because it was about barbecue, but partly it was because of the sort of tone-deaf nature of the response, both by the restaurant owner and by the critic. And what they did was do things like point out the sheer volume of local and neighborhood barbecue restaurants owned by African Americans, talk about how, you know, how the construction of neighborhood and gentrification was connected to where this restaurant was going. After unsuccessfully attempting to talk to the Spork Pit owner about his words, one reader organized a campaign with demands. Asking people not to eat there, asking the magazine to write 1 article a month about the black-owned restaurants, right? Not just 1 article highlighting the fact that they are black and not talking about whether the neighborhood is scary, and offering free, and then she also wanted them to offer free advertising space for 1 year to black-owned restaurants. So everyone knew about this article. Pittsburgh is a small town. Some people have taken up the reader's call, but also positive reviews of the Spork Pit restaurant have appeared in other publications, minus the inflammatory interviews with the owner. But in response to this pressure, the food critic recently wrote an article about an African-American owned barbecue place, opening up his piece with the following statement, and I quote, "A story I wrote about Spork Pit elicited a strong reaction from some readers. One upside of that feedback was for me to prompt a revisit to the Dream Barbecue in Homewood. Sometimes it takes a bit of a wake-up to realize you've been missing out on eating excellent ribs," unquote. So, while his focus is on the absence of food and not the racial ethnic politics of the experience, it is, to me, interesting to see how this kind of debate about place and food and ownership took place in a conversation. The second story is about fried chicken and hip hop. There's a lot to be said about the overdetermination of the relationship between fried chicken and African American culture. And there are a lot of other people who have written about this, most notably Psyche Forson Williams. And in other articles I go into that, and I'm certainly happy to talk about it. But today I just want to relate the story in relation to gentrification. So East Liberty is this other neighborhood in Pittsburgh that is undergoing this transformation. It is also historically, at one point was kind of a shopping destination and really the heart of some of Pittsburgh's kind of economic progress. And then with certain kinds of displacement in the 1950s, it became a lower income neighborhood with some ethnic and also African American enclaves. And then recently, Google has come in and there's been redevelopment. There was a HUD grant that helped them build new housing, and so it's kind of exploded in some ways, but not without debate and controversy and community engagement. So in East Liberty, there's a restaurant, owners have a restaurant on one block, but stories that got published were about a new place they were going to open, which was a fried chicken restaurant with a hip-hop theme. And the owners of these restaurants, again, they do already work and live in the neighborhood, but they are white. And the black residents of East Liberty began complaining on social media, in the news, directly to the owner, given that, you know, they're living in the hotbed of this gentrification debate. And so their response in this case was slightly different than the Spork Pit owner. So the restaurant owners swiftly apologized publicly and in the news media for any contribution that they were making to cultural appropriation, and they changed the restaurant. It's still got fried chicken on the menu, but it's removed the larger references to a black culture. And they went and participated in a set of sessions on unlearning racism with neighborhood residents and others with something called the Good People's Group, whose job it is to help mediate those sessions. As residents themselves pointed out on social media, changing the restaurant will not stop the processes of gentrification that are already underway in the East End of Pittsburgh. Quote, "One more restaurant won't change it." However, the power of residents to speak up about this and about an incoming Whole Foods, right? They weren't necessarily against the Whole Foods per se, but about the lack of consultation that they felt with residents about space use, the creation of a park that the Whole Foods wanted to do that eliminated some affordable housing, in fact, the last affordable housing in that block. And that was interesting to me, right? So in a sense, there's an engagement back and forth about what makes place, what makes food, what makes culture. The food itself is not always the problem. I sympathize with Spike Lee's rant, but I also recognize, and people do recognize, that places change, culture changes, and it's not problematic unless people feel if they are left out or are pushed out. So, for me, what's been very interesting in looking at this is the way in which this culinary enlightenment that Finn talks about is place-based, right? It's not a process we can look at kind of generically and the same across the US and across other spaces. People claim to want foods they recognize from places that are nearby, but they also want access to culture. So in the reconfiguration of that culinary enlightenment into a discourse that's accessible and not about hierarchy and inequality, it seems like one key factor would be to give people voice and power over sovereignty over their neighborhoods in relation to the foods offered and eaten, the stories being told about that space, and the foods therein, and most importantly, their access to it. As one resident said to me, maybe gentrification means something different here. The recent stages of development could be a way to reunite neighborhoods that were separated by urban renewal. What I just want to recognize with some of these stories, and as Dorothy alluded to, you know, with these sort of narratives I've been looking at in other cities, is to say that each place has its own story. And to subsume it all into gentrification, whether you see that as a good or bad thing, you know, basically doesn't give enough to the processes. Sociologist Elijah Anderson, who writes mostly about Philadelphia, described an urban phenomena he calls the cosmopolitan canopy, which are spaces of civility. They often involve food, right? The one that he describes in Philadelphia is something called Reading Terminal, which is a large, literally a terminal, like a railroad terminal that has both retail food that you can buy and prepared food you can buy. And these spaces often involve food, but also public access, where people of diverse experiences of race, class, and gender feel comfortable and can be in one space without animosity. So the question for me is it possible to enjoy, celebrate, and consume in a place without changing its nature or contributing to inequality? So when thinking about food and place and its ability to divide or pull people together, I suggest that this model may be one way to think about this problem, preferably over a meal. Thank you. Right, unhook this. I gotta leave it on. So.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So, no.
I have to stay
right
for
here,
questions.
Yes. We have about 10 minutes for questions, and then you're all invited to a reception upstairs, room 309, catered by Lubbock's own Carol Wilkinson, with whom I think you'll be impressed. So do you want to handle the Q&A yourself?
I'm happy to do that.
Okay,
yeah.
and I'll set my little clock, and when the bell goes off, we have a little gift for you and your stuff.
That's nice. Yeah, don't ask the hard questions that she was. No, I'm happy to.
I got a microphone, so if anybody wants to.
Yeah. Wait.
Studies that the age group people who go out to eat more. In my opinion, my own life, the older I get, the more I go out.
You know, it's funny because we've been having this argument data-wise about this because other folks are arguing that it's driven by millennials, and yet I don't. If you look at sort of income distribution, they don't seem to be people who have as much of the disposable income to be spending to be eating at some of these places. So I think the problem I have with the data is it doesn't break it down as finely grained as I'd like. Like, one of the things that happens is it just tells you about restaurants. It doesn't tell you how expensive the restaurant is or how affordable it is. And so when you look at like who eats out, it just tells you a sort of blanket set of demographics about who eats out, but it doesn't tell you much about where. And marketing folks have tons of that data, but you have to pay for it. So we'd like to, there's a way in which we've been curious about looking at how that plays out. But I think in general, what you see is an exponential increase across the board of people eating food that's prepared outside the home. Right? So whether they're getting a takeout or to-go or prepared food at the supermarket, the amount that people are eating outside the home is dramatically increased. So, yeah.
I have a question. I was born and raised in France where, we never ate out.
Right.
We ate out once a year. And yet, it's this perception that, everything is around food in France. We just don't talk about it. And we had meals around family. But I came to America and everybody's obsessed with food.
Totally.
You turn on the TV and it's, ads about food. And even the vocabulary is, you have terms like you're a foodie. And these things, I'm very intrigued by this love-hate relationship that Americans have. It's very competitive, and and some of the dishes that I grew up with, like beef bourguignon, that were sociologically paired up with the poor class,
right?
Here are extremely fancy. So I'm
yeah.
couldn't eat beef bourguignon, all the bad meat.
Right.
So I'm very intrigued with concepts, and we talked about Pierre Bourdieu. I like how he says it's related to language, and it says a lot about taste, and it classifies people. And then there's another sociologist called Jean Roger who talks about how the suburbs,
right,
and North African dishes, and so it relates to urban spaces that you're mentioning. but I'm very intrigued with, why is it that in urban spaces here it's just so important? Why is this constant fight for, identifying who's, it's almost a race for the best.
Absolutely. Yeah, and and I'm not, part of the reason I'm looking at this is I'm not 100% satisfied with the theories that are out there. So, the book titled Foodies and Margot Finn's book about discriminating taste, they put forth some really interesting ideas discursively, but it doesn't quite, it only gets at one component of it, right? The point is that those are not necessarily the only people eating, the only people talking about what belongs in a neighborhood, So, and to me, I think in the U.S., in urban areas, so much of it is related to kind of what Krishnendu Ray is talking about, this kind of ethnic succession, that it's not only just in terms of restaurants, but in terms of who lives in urban areas and how they occupy a neighborhood space or how they don't, right? Is it an enclave? Is it spread out through the city? Kind of earlier waves, you have people living in these kind of enclaves and whether or not they were accessible to others, right? So it's a great piece from 1990s about New York Jews and Chinese food, right? So that why is it that New York Jews eat Chinese food, right? And a lot of it had to do with the fact that those were the restaurants that were accessible, but it also had to do with the fact that they were immigrant groups coming in at different points in time, and so in a way, for these Eastern Europeans coming to New York, eating the Chinese food was a sign of sophistication, right? They knew things. They knew the names, the dishes. It was a way of kind of becoming modern. And I think that idea of becoming modern, is conflated in America with that urbanization and that kind of knowledge, right? And it is incredibly competitive because foods is I think the one realm where people can afford it. Right? So you may not have a lot, but you may be able to participate in different ways, whether it's by watching it and consuming it on television or by, eating once or twice at these places. Yeah. So.
It's a subject that's relatively new to me. Very interesting presentation. I'm wondering, though, if there's a kind of more benign side of the foodie culture and its combination with gentrification. I would guess, and you can tell me whether I'm guessing wrong or right, but I would guess if you went into many of these gentrified areas and looked at the more upscale and fashionable restaurants that are open, you would find, set aside sort of the black, white, or black Hispanic difference, you would find that a lot of them are catering to a very cosmopolitan ethnic clientele. That is to say, the backgrounds of the people who are dining in these restaurants. Maybe they're unified by being able to afford the restaurant, aspiring to the culture that the restaurant represents them. But in terms of their ancestries, they may be very, very different. Asians, European from various parts of the world, people who have income and are kind of mixing in a kind of new middle-class American culture, one of whose defining features is a like for diverse foodstuffs and enjoying the ambiance of restaurants that are quote unquote upscale. Maybe that's a positive thing.
To me, I would see that as one possible narrative for certain cities, right? In other words, and that's what I'm trying to say about these examples as well, right? In a sense that to be able to tell one story about urbanization and gentrification is wrong, because these American cities are experiencing this in different ways, and so. When you start describing that clientele, I think of New York or I think of Toronto. I think of certain cities that have that sort of strata of people. But in certain other cities, I think you have to also think about the fact that, number one, some of these mid-sized cities are still extremely segregated, don't necessarily have those waves of migration that are middle class, and the consumption that we're talking about isn't necessarily always in quote-unquote high-end restaurant. It's a space that develops a reputation or develops a, kind of a following or whatever. So there's so much variation in there to me, what I'd like to start looking at them as specific stories about specific places. And so, what you described to me sounds like it'd be great to see if we could find the model that fits, right? and because when I look at some of these others, I see different things going on. In Pittsburgh, that's not necessarily always the case, right? In Cleveland, I'm not sure that's the case, right? So, but again, it's like I'm reluctant to say that there's a kind of a homogeneous process that we can describe until we know more.
We have time for one more question.
Yeah. So, it can be loud.
First of all, thank you so much for your talk and
Thanks.
for reminding us of the interconnectedness between food and politics and identities. I teach foreign languages, and it's something that, of course, as you already brought up, a lot of folks associated with learning foreign language, learning culture, equals learning about the food. So we're trying to bring in issues of food consumption and food waste and dispel some of these stereotypes, particularly about French culture, which we know.
Yeah.
So thank you for all of this. My question is about food trucks. To what extent do food trucks...
Food trucks are the anti-gentrifier.
To what extent they fit into the narratives you've studied in this discussion?
Yeah, after I started writing this, I started thinking, I'm going to have to start paying attention to that. And actually, there's a really wonderful book coming out this year from University of Illinois Press, Robert Lemon. It's called Taco Truck. And he does ethnographic work in San Antonio and Cleveland and a third locale, I can't remember. It's phenomenal, and he really looks at similar to what I'm talking about. I mean, he does the work I don't want to do, right? He looks at this in relation to those spaces, and he argues a lot about even a mobile space like the truck actually has kind of a physical relationship to place, and where, so in other words, where they'll go. Like where the truck will go is an important question. And if it's a truck that's in the same locale all the time, then sometimes the processes are similar to what we've been talking about in terms of gentrification, right? So can a truck be someplace? Does it draw people in? Is it an attractive feature of a neighborhood? So yeah, it's really interesting. He finds different things in different cities, right? In San Antonio, he finds one story about where the trucks are allowed to go, and he ties it to regulation. Now that's a big difference with the trucks, is where the trucks are allowed to go are differently regulated than, for example, what it takes in terms of state and federal food safety regulations and liquor licenses to open a restaurant, and so that's kind of a major factor. So yeah, it's cool. So, thank you.
Thank you. So since Alice has enlightened us so much about place, we have a little something for her about this place, so she'll remember us. You have to open it now.
Okay. I've got stuff. Oh, this is great.
Can you see what it says?
That's awesome. So I have one of these that says Amherst on the bottom.
Well, now you get Lubbock.
But now I have a good one. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for being here. And room 309, the elevators are right over there. You won't be disappointed. Thanks.
Fabulous.